This is HOA consequences. I did not raise my voice. I raised my evidence packet. I am standing in my driveway in Billings, Montana, holding a paintbrush that is dripping stain onto a drop cloth, and Brenda Anderson is 5 feet away screaming that my fence color looks dark, and dark means prohibited. You are not allowed to do that without permission. Her voice cracks on the last word and she steps closer, waving a stack of pre-filled forms in my face. I work as a commercial photographer, so I always have a camera and extra batteries on me, and right now my phone is in my hand recording every word. Behind me, fence panels are staged in my driveway because the delivery truck dropped them off 2 hours ago, and Brenda called it visible storage the moment the driver pulled away. She is wearing a blue light jacket with the hood up even though the rain stopped an hour ago, and her blonde hair is pulled back in a tight ponytail so severe it looks like it hurts. I am in my blue hoodie, with the hood up and a red baseball cap underneath, and I am trying not to laugh, because this is the 3rd time this week she has shown up, unannounced, to tell me I am violating Harbor Point Ridge Association rules. She taps the forms against her palm and says I have all day, and so does my fine meter. I ask her what meter, and she pulls out a stopwatch from her jacket pocket and clicks it on. She says every hour I leave these panels visible in the driveway is another $50 fine. And if I start staining without approval, it jumps to $500 per day. I tell her the panels are not permanent storage. They are materials for a permitted project. And she cuts me off. She says the permit does not cover staging and does not cover color choice and does not cover anything unless the architectural committee signs off first. I hold up my phone and say I have the permit right here in my email, and she says email is not a legal document. I say the city disagrees, and she says the city does not run this neighborhood. A gate technician with a tool bag walks up the driveway mid-argument and asks if this is the Anderson property. Brenda spins around and says no, this is not her house. This is the problem house. The technician looks confused and says he is here to check the automatic gate at the front entrance because someone reported it closing too fast. Brenda tells him he needs to leave because this is a private enforcement matter, and he says he just needs a signature. I offer to sign, and Brenda blocks me with her body and says I do not live at the gate. The technician shrugs and walks back down the driveway. Brenda turns back to me and says that was obstruction of HOA business, and she is adding it to my file. I ask her what file, and she says I already have 6 notices on record. I tell her I have never received 6 notices, and she says that is because I refused delivery. I say I have been home every day, and she says I did not answer the door fast enough. I count to 3 in my head, because I know if I yell she will say I threatened her. I tell her I am going to finish staining my fence panels and install them tomorrow, and if she has a problem with it, she can take it up with the city. She says the city does not have jurisdiction over aesthetics, and HOA covenants are legally binding. I say covenants are not a blank check, and she says that is not for me to decide. She taps the forms again and says I can make this a lean conversation in 1 email. That is the moment I know I am going to have to fight this all the way to the top. Brenda is the landscaping committee lead, and she complains daily about every tiny detail in the neighborhood. But this time, she is targeting me because my fence project is on a deadline. My car is parked under a carport at the edge of my property, and the HOA has been threatening to tow it unless I move it to a covered garage, but I do not have a covered garage. I need the fence finished so I can build a compliant enclosure around the carport before the towing notice goes into effect. If they tow my car, I lose my commute, and I cannot get to client shoots on time. My whole business collapses. Brenda steps over to the fence panels and runs her hand along the top edge. She says the stain is still wet, and that means I started work without approval. I say I was testing the color on a sample board, and she points to the drop cloth and says, that is not a sample board. That is a full panel. I tell her it is my panel on my property, and she says it is in violation of the visible storage clause. She pulls out her phone and takes a photo of the panel, then another photo of me holding the brush, then a third photo of the muddy ground with my footprints leading to the stack. She says these are going in the report, and the board meeting is in 2 days. I ask her if the board knows she is out here harassing residents, and she says she is not harassing anyone. She is enforcing community standards. I say community standards do not include stopping construction on a permitted project, and she says the permit is invalid because it was never submitted to the architectural committee. I pull up the email chain on my phone and show her the submission confirmation from 3 weeks ago. She glances at it and says the confirmation is automated and does not mean the committee reviewed it. I ask her who is on the committee, and she says that is confidential. I say I have a right to know who is making decisions about my property, and she says I can file a formal request with the management company and pay the records fee. I ask her how much the fee is, and she says it depends on the scope. I say I just want the names of the committee members, and she says names are not stored separately, so they would have to pull the entire meeting minutes archive, and that costs $200. I tell her that is insane, and she says it is standard procedure. I say I will take it up with the board, and she says the board sets the fees. I ask if she is on the board, and she smiles and says she is the vice president. Brenda checks her stopwatch and says I have been in violation for 2 hours and 17 minutes, so that is 3 fines at $50 each. I tell her she cannot fine me for panels that are not even installed yet, and she says the violation is visibility, not installation. I say visibility is subjective, and she says the covenant defines it as anything that can be seen from the street or common areas. I point out that my driveway is not a common area, and she says the covenant defines common areas as any space accessible to multiple residents, and the driveway is connected to the main road, so it qualifies. I tell her that logic would make every driveway a common area, and she says exactly, welcome to the rules. I put the paintbrush down on the drop cloth and tell her I am not paying any fines because I have not violated anything. She says refusal to pay results in automatic escalation to a lien, and if the lien is not resolved within 30 days, the HOA can foreclose. I laugh because it sounds like a joke, but her face does not change. She says the covenant enforcement section is very clear, and she has already filed 6 notices. So the next step is legal action. I ask her to show me the 6 notices, and she says they are in the HOA office. I say I want copies, and she says I can request them for the records fee. I say I am not paying $200 for copies of notices I never received, and she says that is my choice. Brenda turns to leave, and I stop her. I say I want to know why she is targeting me specifically, because I have seen other residents with way worse violations, and she never says a word. She stops and looks back. She says I do not know what I am talking about, and I say I have photos. I pull up my camera roll and show her a shot from last month of a house 3 streets over with an entire shed built in the front yard. She glances at it and says that shed was pre-approved. I say it is 6 feet tall and painted bright yellow, and she says color choice is subjective. I say you just told me my stain is too dark, and she says that is different because my fence is on the boundary, and visibility standards are stricter for boundary structures. I ask her to show me where in the covenant it says that, and she says it is implied. I tell her implied is not enforceable, and she says the board interprets the covenant, and their interpretation is binding. I ask if the board has meeting minutes that document the interpretation, and she says yes. I ask for a copy, and she says records fee. I tell her I am going to file a complaint with the state HOA ombudsman, and she laughs. She says Montana does not have an ombudsman, and even if it did, the covenant gives the board sole authority over enforcement. I say sole authority does not mean unchecked authority, and she says it does in this neighborhood. She walks back to her car, and I stand there holding my phone, watching her pull away. My hands are shaking because I know this is not going to stop. Brenda is not just enforcing rules, she is weaponizing them to stall me until my deadline collapses. The fence materials delivery is arriving tomorrow morning at 8, and if she calls it dumping immediately, the contractor will not touch it. I cannot afford to delay because the towing notice on my car is active in 10 days, and I need the fence up and the enclosure framed before that happens. I go inside and call the HOA management company. The receptionist answers, and I explain the situation. She puts me on hold for 6 minutes, and then comes back and says Brenda is within her rights to issue notices for visible storage. I tell her the panels are not storage, they are construction materials for a permitted project. And she says the permit does not override the visibility clause. I ask her who approved the permit, and she says the city did, but the HOA has separate approval authority. I tell her I submitted the architectural review 3 weeks ago and never heard back, and she says the committee has 45 days to respond. I say 45 days is longer than my deadline, and she says that is not the HOA's problem. I ask to speak to someone higher up, and she transfers me to a voicemail. I leave a message explaining everything and asking for an emergency review, and I get an auto-reply email saying the office is closed until Monday. It is Thursday. I hang up and sit down at my kitchen table with a notebook. I start writing down every interaction I have had with Brenda, every notice she claims to have filed, every threat she has made. I pull up my security camera footage and scrub through the last 3 weeks looking for any time she came to my door. I find 2 clips, one from last Tuesday where she left a notice tucked into my mailbox, and one from last Friday where she took photos of my property from the sidewalk. I download both clips and save them to 3 different drives. My phone buzzes, and it is a text from my neighbor 2 doors down. He says Brenda just knocked on his door and asked if I have been making noise late at night. I call him, and he says she was fishing for complaints, asking if I play loud music or run power tools after 10. He told her no, and she asked if he was sure. He said yes, and she left. I thank him and ask if she has ever done this before. He says she did the same thing to another neighbor last year when he wanted to repaint his house. The neighbor ended up paying the HOA $1,500 in fines and repainting it a different color just to make it stop. I hang up and look at the fence panels in my driveway. I need a new plan. I cannot fight this the normal way because Brenda controls the timeline and the process. I need leverage. I need something that forces the HOA to back off before my car gets towed and my business collapses. I nod like I am losing because I want her to get comfortable. If she thinks I am beaten, she will get sloppy. I spend the rest of the evening digging through the HOA covenant document. It is 73 pages long and written in dense legal language that loops back on itself. I find the section on architectural review, and it says the committee has 45 days to respond. But it also says failure to respond constitutes approval. I highlight that sentence and keep reading. The next paragraph says approval is not automatic if the committee requests additional information. and the request resets the clock. I check my email and find a message from 3 weeks ago that I missed. It is from an address I do not recognize, and the subject line is Architectural Review Follow-up. I open it, and it is a form letter saying the committee needs additional details about my fence height and setback. The email is dated 2 days after I submitted the review, which means they responded immediately, and I did not see it because it went to my spam folder. I forward the email to myself and mark it as important. Then I reply to the original email and say I am providing the requested details, and I attach the city permit, the contractor's survey, and the materials list. I send it and wait. 5 minutes later, I get a bounce back saying the email address is no longer active. I check the original email again and see the address is Ho Architecture Temp at the management company domain. I call the management company and ask about the temp address. The receptionist says they shut it down last year, and now all architectural reviews go through a web portal. I ask why I got an email from that address 3 weeks ago, and she says she does not know. Maybe it was an automated reply from an old system. I hang up and stare at my laptop screen. Someone sent me a fake follow-up email to reset the approval clock. The address looks official enough that I would not have questioned it if I had seen it on time. But the timing is too perfect. Brenda knew I was about to get automatic approval, and she wanted to stall me. I check the email metadata and see it was sent from an IP address in Billings. I cross-reference it with the HOA office location, and it does not match. I run the IP through a lookup tool, and it comes back as a residential address 4 blocks away. I pull up the HOA directory and search for that address. It belongs to Brenda Anderson. I sit back and let that sink in. Brenda sent me a fake email from a dead address to make it look like the committee requested more information, which reset the approval timeline and gave her an excuse to keep issuing violations. That is fraud. That is actual, prosecutable fraud. I screenshot the email, the metadata, the IP lookup, and the directory entry. I save everything to a folder labeled Evidence, and I do not tell anyone. Not yet. The next morning I wake up at 6 and go outside to move the fence panels. The contractor is supposed to arrive at 8, and I want everything staged and ready so Brenda does not have an excuse to call it dumping. I am halfway through stacking the panels against the side of my house when Brenda pulls into my driveway. She gets out of her car holding a clipboard and a camera. She is wearing the same blue light jacket with the hood up, and she has her work gloves tucked into her belt. She walks up to me and says the panels are still in violation of the visibility clause. I tell her I am moving them right now, and she says the violation already occurred, so the fine stands. She takes a photo of the panels with her camera, then another photo of me, then a wide shot of my entire property. She checks the clipboard and says I am also in violation of the landscaping code because I have not edged my lawn in 2 weeks. I look down at the grass, and it is fine. I tell her the grass is fine, and she says the covenant requires weekly edging during growing season. I ask her what growing season means, and she says April through October. I say it is November, and she says the season does not end until the first hard freeze, and we have not had a hard freeze yet. I point out that it rained yesterday and the ground is muddy, and she says that is not an excuse. The contractor pulls up in a white truck with a trailer full of posts and tools. He gets out and introduces himself and asks where I want the fence line. I show him the survey stakes, and he nods and starts unloading. Brenda walks over and asks if he has a permit. He says the homeowner has the permit, and she says she needs to see it. I pull out my phone and show her the PDF, and she says she needs a physical copy. I tell her the city does not issue physical copies anymore, and she says the HOA requires physical documentation for all contractor work. The contractor looks at me and I shake my head. I tell him to ignore her and start the install. He hesitates, and Brenda says if he proceeds without proper documentation, she will report him to the city, and the HOA will file a complaint with his licensing board. The contractor looks at me again, and I can see he is weighing the risk. I tell him I will handle it, and he says he needs to make a call. He walks back to his truck and gets on his phone. Brenda turns to me and says this is exactly what happens when residents try to bypass the process. I tell her there is no bypass. I followed every rule, and I have the permits to prove it. She says the permits are invalid because the architectural committee never approved them. I tell her the committee had 45 days and they did not respond, so the approval is automatic. She says the committee requested additional information, which resets the clock. I say I never received a request, and she says that is not the HOA's problem. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more real HOA revenge stories. I pull out my phone and open the screenshot folder. I show Brenda the fake email with the metadata and the IP lookup. I tell her I know she sent it from her house, and I know the email address was deactivated last year. Her face does not change, but her hand tightens on the clipboard. She says I do not know what I am talking about, and I say I have the server logs. She says logs can be faked, and I say so can emails. I tell her I am going to forward everything to the HOA attorney and the management company, and she says they will not care. I say, we will find out. The contractor walks back over and says he is not comfortable starting the install with an active dispute. I ask him if he can come back tomorrow, and he says he has another job lined up and he cannot reschedule. I tell him I will pay a rush fee, and he says it is not about the money, it is about liability. If the HOA files a complaint with the licensing board, he could lose his contractor's license, and he cannot risk that for one fence. He apologizes and starts loading his tools back into the truck. Brenda watches him leave and then turns to me and says this is what happens when you do not follow the rules. I stand in my driveway and watch the contractor drive away. My fence is not getting built today. My car is still at risk. My business is still in danger. And Brenda is still smiling. I walk inside and sit down at my kitchen table. I open my laptop and start drafting an email to the HOA attorney. I explain the situation, attach the evidence, and ask for an emergency review. I send it and get an auto reply saying the attorney is out of the office until next week. I close the laptop and put my head in my hands. My phone buzzes, and it is a text from my ally, a local mediator named Sarah, who helped me with a contractor dispute last year. She says she heard through the neighborhood grapevine that I am having HOA trouble, and she wants to know if I need help. I call her and explain everything. She listens and then says I need to document every interaction and file a formal complaint with the board. I tell her I already tried that, and the board is stacked with Brenda's allies. She says that is fine. I do not need to win at the board level. I just need to create a paper trail so I can escalate to a lawsuit if necessary. I ask her how much a lawsuit costs, and she says it depends, but probably $10,000 to $20,000. I tell her I do not have that kind of money, and she says I might not need it. She says if the HOA is acting in bad faith, I can file a complaint with the Montana Department of Justice, and they will investigate for free. I ask her what qualifies as bad faith, and she says fraud, harassment, selective enforcement, and retaliation. I tell her I have evidence of all four, and she says then I have a case. She tells me to keep documenting everything and to send her copies of all my evidence. I thank her and hang up. I spend the next 2 hours organizing my files and uploading everything to a shared drive. I send Sarah the link, and she replies within 10 minutes saying this is solid and I should move fast. The next day is the HOA board meeting. It is scheduled for 7 in the evening at the community center, and Brenda made sure my fence violation is on the agenda. I show up at 6:45 with a folder full of printed evidence and my phone charged to 100%. The meeting room is small and cold, with a folding table at the front and rows of plastic chairs facing it. Brenda is already there, sitting at the table with 4 other board members. She is wearing a gray sun hat, and her work gloves are sitting on the table in front of her like a threat. I take a seat in the front row and wait. The meeting starts exactly at 7, and the board president, a man in his 60s with a gray beard, reads through the agenda. My fence violation is item 4 out of 7. I sit through 3 other discussions about landscaping budgets and pool maintenance, and then the president calls my name. He says the board has received multiple notices of violation regarding my fence project, and they need to determine the appropriate enforcement action. Brenda raises her hand and says she has documentation. She pulls out a stack of photos and passes them around the table. The other board members look at the photos and nod. One of them says it looks like a clear violation, and another says the visibility clause is unambiguous. The president asks me if I want to respond, and I stand up. I say I have a city permit, and I submitted an architectural review 3 weeks ago. Brenda interrupts and says the review was incomplete, and the committee requested additional information. I say I never received a request, and she says that is not the board's problem. I pull out my phone and open the evidence folder. I say I have proof that the request was fraudulent and sent from Brenda's personal IP address. The room goes quiet. The president looks at Brenda and asks if that is true. She says I do not know what I am talking about, and the email was sent by the management company. I say the email address was deactivated last year, and the management company confirmed it. The president asks me to forward the evidence to the board, and I say I already sent it to the HOA attorney. He says the attorney has not mentioned it, and I say the attorney has been out of the office all week. One of the other board members, a woman with short gray hair, says this sounds like something the board should investigate before taking enforcement action. Brenda says there is nothing to investigate, and the violation is clear. The woman says fraud is a serious accusation, and the board has a duty to review it. Brenda says I am making up stories to avoid accountability, and the woman says that is for the board to decide, not Brenda. The president says the board will table the enforcement action until the attorney reviews the evidence. Brenda slams her hand on the table and says that is unacceptable. She says I have been in violation for days, and every day the board delays is another day the neighborhood standards are eroded. The president says the board has a legal obligation to act in good faith, and rushing to enforcement without reviewing evidence is not good faith. Brenda says the board is setting a dangerous precedent, and the president says the meeting is moving on to the next agenda item. I sit back down and let out a breath. It is not a win, but it is not a loss either. Brenda is glaring at me from the table, and I can see her jaw working like she is grinding her teeth. After the meeting ends, I walk out to my car, and Sarah texts me asking how it went. I tell her the board tabled the enforcement, and she says that is huge. She says now I need to push for a full investigation and make sure the attorney actually reviews the evidence. I tell her I will follow up on Monday, and she says good, keep me posted. I drive home and park under the carport. The towing notice is still taped to my windshield. Counting down. I have 8 days left. I go inside and sit down at my kitchen table with my laptop. I start drafting a formal complaint to the Montana Department of Justice. I outline the fraud, the harassment, the selective enforcement, and the retaliation. I attach every piece of evidence I have, and I include a timeline of every interaction with Brenda. It takes me 3 hours to finish, and when I am done, it is 22 pages long. I read it over twice, and then hit send. The next morning, I wake up to a voicemail from the HOA attorney. He says he received my evidence, and he needs to schedule a call to discuss it. I call him back, and we talk for 30 minutes. He says the email metadata is compelling, and if it is accurate, then Brenda violated the covenant and possibly committed fraud. I ask him what happens next, and he says he needs to interview Brenda and review the HOA's email records. I ask him how long that will take, and he says at least 2 weeks. I tell him I do not have 2 weeks because my car is getting towed in 8 days, and he says that is a separate issue. I say it is not separate, it is retaliation, and he says he cannot stop a towing notice without board approval. I hang up and text Sarah. I tell her the attorney is slow-walking the investigation, and she says that is typical. She says I need to force the issue by filing a police report for the fraud. I ask her if the police will care, and she says maybe, maybe not, but it creates another paper trail, and it puts pressure on the HOA to act. I drive to the police station and ask to file a report. The officer at the desk asks what happened, and I explain the fake email and the IP lookup. He takes notes and says it sounds like a civil matter. I say it is fraud, and he says fraud requires intent to deceive for financial gain. I say Brenda was trying to stall me so she could issue fines, which is financial gain for the HOA. He says that is a stretch, but he will file the report anyway. I leave the station with a case number and drive back home. My phone buzzes, and it is a text from Brenda. She says I am making false accusations, and if I do not retract them, she will sue me for defamation. I screenshot the text and forward it to Sarah. She replies immediately and says, "Do not respond, do not engage, just document." I put my phone down and go outside to check on the fence panels. Someone has moved the survey stakes. I know exactly where they were because I took photos after the surveyor left, and now they are 6 inches closer to my property line. I check my security camera footage and see a car pulling into my driveway at 2 in the morning. The headlights are off, and the driver gets out and walks to the stakes with a flashlight. The footage is grainy, but I can see the outline of a blue jacket and a gray hat. It is Brenda. I download the clip and send it to Sarah and the HOA attorney. Sarah calls me within 5 minutes and says this is huge. She says tampering with a survey is illegal, and I need to call the police again. I drive back to the station and show the officer the footage. He watches it twice and says he cannot see the face clearly enough to confirm identity. I tell him it is Brenda, and he says I need more evidence. I ask him what kind of evidence, and he says something that definitively places her at the scene. I tell him the footage shows her car, and he says cars can be borrowed or stolen. I leave the station and drive to the surveyor's office. I explain what happened and ask if he can come back out to verify the stakes. He says he can, but it will cost $300 for an emergency visit. I tell him I will pay it, and he says he can come out tomorrow morning. That night I set up a second camera aimed directly at the survey stakes. I angle it so it captures the entire property line, and I turn on motion detection. At 1 in the morning, the motion alert goes off. I check the live feed and see Brenda walking up my driveway with a flashlight and a pair of gloves. She kneels down at the stakes and starts pulling them out. I grab my phone and run outside. I turn on my flashlight and yell her name. She freezes and looks up. I tell her I am recording and she is trespassing. She stands up and says she is conducting an HOA inspection. I say inspections do not happen at 1 in the morning, and she says the covenant does not specify a time. I tell her to leave, and she says she is not done. I say, if she does not leave, I am calling the police, and she says go ahead. I call the police and stay on the line. The dispatcher says an officer is on the way and asks me to stay outside and keep the suspect in view. Brenda hears this and starts walking back to her car. I follow her with my flashlight and my phone still recording. She gets in her car and starts the engine. I stand in front of the car and tell her to wait for the police. She honks the horn and I do not move. She honks again and revs the engine. I step to the side and she pulls out of the driveway, tires squealing. The police cruiser pulls up 2 minutes later, and I show the officer the footage. He watches it and says he can issue a citation for trespassing, but I need to come to the station tomorrow to file a formal complaint. I say I will be there first thing, and he says good. He asks if I want him to do a property check, and I say yes. He walks around my house with his flashlight and finds nothing else disturbed. He gives me his card and says call if she comes back. The surveyor arrives at 8 the next morning and checks the stakes. He says they were definitely moved, and he can provide a written statement confirming the original placement. I ask him if he can also confirm the date, and he says yes, he has GPS logs from the original survey. I pay him the $300, and he hands me a signed affidavit. I drive to the police station and file a formal complaint for trespassing and tampering. The officer at the desk says the case will be assigned to a detective, and I should expect a call within a few days. I leave the station and drive to the community center. The HOA office is in a small room at the back of the building. I walk in and ask to see the board president. The receptionist says he is not available, and I ask when he will be. She says she does not know, and I say I will wait. I sit down in the lobby and pull out my phone. I text Sarah and tell her what happened. She says I am doing everything right and the pressure is building. She says Brenda is making mistakes because she is panicking, and that is good for me. The board president walks out of his office 20 minutes later and sees me sitting in the lobby. He looks tired. He asks what I need, and I tell him I have new evidence of Brenda tampering with my property survey. I hand him the affidavit and the security camera footage on a flash drive. He takes it and says he will review it. I ask him how long the review will take, and he says he does not know. I tell him my car is getting towed in 6 days, and I need this resolved before that happens. He says he cannot stop a towing notice without a full board vote, and the next meeting is not for 2 weeks. I tell him he can call an emergency meeting, and he says emergency meetings require a majority board vote to convene. I ask him to call the vote, and he says he will try. I leave the office and drive home. My phone buzzes with a call from an unknown number. I answer, and it is the detective assigned to my case. He says he reviewed the complaint and the footage, and he wants to interview Brenda. I ask him when, and he says he already reached out, and she has agreed to come in tomorrow. I ask him if I should be there, and he says no. This is just an initial interview. He says he will call me after and let me know what happens. I thank him, and hang up. I text Sarah, and she says this is moving faster than she expected. She says once the police are involved, the HOA usually backs off because they do not want the liability. I tell her I hope she is right, and she says trust the process. The next day, I wait for the detective to call. He does not call. I text him and get no response. I call the station, and the receptionist says he is in meetings all day. I ask if she can leave a message, and she says she will. I hang up and pace around my house. My car is getting towed in 5 days. I still do not have a fence. I still do not have an enclosure. I am running out of time. I sit down at my kitchen table and open my laptop. I pull up the covenant document again and search for any clause that might help me. I find a section on dispute resolution that says any resident can request binding arbitration if they believe the HOA is acting in bad faith. I highlight the section and read it 3 times. Arbitration costs money, but it is faster than a lawsuit, and it forces the HOA to respond immediately. I call Sarah and ask her about arbitration. She says it is a good option, but I need to file the request in writing and pay a filing fee. I ask how much, and she says usually $500. I tell her I will do it, and she says she can help me draft the request. We spend the next hour on the phone going through the evidence and building the case. She says I have everything I need: fraud, harassment, selective enforcement, retaliation, and tampering. She says the arbitrator will almost certainly rule in my favor. I ask her how long the process takes, and she says usually 60 to 90 days. I tell her I do not have 60 days, and she says I can request an emergency hearing. I ask her how, and she says I need to prove immediate and irreparable harm. I tell her my car is getting towed in 5 days, and my business depends on it. She says that is immediate and irreparable harm. I draft the arbitration request and attach every piece of evidence. I include the fake email, the IP lookup, the security camera footage, the survey affidavit, the police report, and the towing notice. I explain the timeline and the harm, and I request an emergency hearing within 7 days. I print 3 copies and drive to the HOA office. I hand 1 copy to the receptionist and ask her to log it. She stamps it with a date and gives me a receipt. I keep the other 2 copies for my records. I drive home and email the arbitration request to the HOA attorney, the board president, and Sarah. I copy the detective on the email and add a note asking for an update on the interview. I hit send and wait. The detective calls me 2 hours later. He says he interviewed Brenda and she denied everything. She said she has never been to my property at night, and the footage must be doctored. I ask him if he believes her, and he says it does not matter what he believes. He needs more evidence to move forward. I tell him I have the surveyor affidavit, and he says that proves the stakes were moved, but it does not prove Brenda moved them. I ask him what kind of evidence he needs, and he says a clear face shot or a witness. I tell him the footage shows her car and her jacket, and he says cars can be borrowed and jackets can be bought. I hang up and throw my phone on the couch. I text Sarah, and she says do not panic. She says the arbitration request is the better path anyway, because it does not require criminal proof, just a preponderance of evidence. I ask her what that means, and she says it means more likely than not, which is a much lower bar than beyond a reasonable doubt. She says the arbitrator will look at the footage and the affidavit and the pattern of harassment and rule in my favor. I ask her how she can be so sure, and she says because she has done this before, and HOAs almost always lose when they get caught acting in bad faith. The next morning, I get an email from the HOA attorney. He says the board has reviewed my arbitration request, and they are willing to settle. I call Sarah immediately, and she says, "This is good." She says settlements are faster and cheaper than arbitration, and I have all the leverage. I ask her what I should demand, and she says full dismissal of all fines and violations, written acknowledgement that the architectural review was improperly handled, removal of the towing notice, and a formal apology from the board. I tell her that sounds like a lot, and she says I am entitled to it. She says I should also demand that Brenda be removed from any enforcement role. I ask if the board will agree to that, and she says they will if the alternative is arbitration and a lawsuit. I reply to the attorney and list my demands. I also include a deadline, 48 hours to respond, or I proceed with arbitration. He replies within an hour and says the board needs to meet to discuss it. I say they have 48 hours, and he says he understands. I sit back and wait. My car is getting towed in 3 days. I still do not have a fence. I am barely holding it together. 40 hours later, the attorney calls me. He says the board has agreed to all my demands except the removal of Brenda. He says Brenda is an elected board member, and only the residents can vote her out. I tell him that is not good enough, and he says the board is willing to remove her from the landscaping committee and bar her from any enforcement activity. I ask if that is in writing, and he says yes. It will be part of the settlement agreement. I tell him I want the agreement drafted today, and he says he can have it ready by tomorrow morning. I tell him I want it today, and he says he will do his best. I hang up and text Sarah. She says this is a huge win, and I should take it. I tell her I am worried Brenda will find another way to retaliate, and she says that is what restraining orders are for. The attorney emails me the settlement agreement at 6 that evening. I read it 3 times and then forward it to Sarah. She says it looks solid and I should sign it. I print it, sign it, scan it, and email it back. The attorney confirms receipt and says the board will sign it tomorrow, and the towing notice will be lifted immediately. I ask him to send me written confirmation of the towing notice lift, and he says he will. I sit down on my couch and close my eyes. It is not over yet, but I can finally breathe. The next morning, I get an email from the board president. He says the settlement is finalized, and all fines and violations are dismissed. He also says the towing notice has been lifted, and I have 60 days to complete my fence project without interference. I forward the email to Sarah, and she replies with a champagne emoji. I text my contractor and ask if he can come back out. He says he can start next week, and I tell him that works. I hang up and walk outside to check the survey stakes. They are still in the wrong spot. I move them back to the original placement and take photos for my records. At 2 in the afternoon, I get a call from the detective. He says he is closing the trespassing case because Brenda has agreed to a diversion program. I ask him what that means, and he says she has to attend a mediation session and agree not to contact me for 6 months. If she complies, the charge gets dropped. I ask him if that is it, and he says that is all he can do without more evidence. I thank him and hang up. It is not the outcome I wanted, but it is something. The board meeting happens 2 weeks later, and I show up just to watch. Brenda is sitting at the table with the other board members, but she does not look at me. The president reads through the agenda, and when he gets to the architectural committee report, he pauses. He says the board has decided to restructure the committee and appoint new leadership. He does not say Brenda's name, but everyone in the room knows what he means. One of the other board members, the woman with short gray hair, stands up and reads a prepared statement. She says the board conducted an internal review, and found that certain enforcement actions were inconsistent with the covenant and the board's fiduciary duty. She says the board is committed to fair and transparent enforcement going forward. She does not apologize, but it is close enough. After the meeting, I walk out to my car, and Sarah texts me asking how it went. I tell her the board issued a public statement, and Brenda is off the committee. She says that is as close to a win as I am going to get. I tell her I wish I could do more, and she says I did plenty. She says I created a paper trail, forced an investigation, and got the settlement. She says most people do not get that far. I thank her and drive home. A week later, the contractor shows up and starts the fence install. It takes 2 days, and when it is done, I walk the property line and check every post. The fence is exactly where the survey said it should be, exactly the height the permit allows, and exactly the color I wanted. I take photos from every angle and send them to Sarah. She replies with a thumbs up emoji. I sit down on my back porch and look at the fence. It is not just a fence. It is proof that I fought the HOA and won. 2 weeks after that, I get a call from the board president. He says the board is holding a special meeting to discuss new architectural review procedures, and he wants my input. I ask him why, and he says because my case exposed serious flaws in the process, and the board wants to fix them. I tell him I am not interested in being on a committee, and he says that is fine. He just wants me to review the draft policy and provide feedback. I tell him I will think about it, and he says thank you. I hang up and text Sarah. She says this is a huge deal because it means the board is taking accountability. I tell her I am not sure I trust them, and she says I do not have to trust them. I just have to hold them accountable. The draft policy arrives in my email 3 days later. It is 8 pages long, and it overhauls the entire architectural review process. It includes mandatory timelines, automatic approval if the committee does not respond, a public appeals process, and a requirement that all committee communications go through the management company's official portal. It also includes a clause that says any board member found to have acted in bad faith can be removed by a majority vote. I read it twice and then forward it to Sarah. She says it is exactly what I asked for in the arbitration demand. I reply and say I know. That is why I am suspicious. She says take the win. I attend the special meeting and watch the board vote on the new policy. It passes unanimously. Brenda is not at the meeting. I ask the president where she is, and he says she resigned from the board last week. I ask him why, and he says it was a personal decision. I do not push it. After the meeting, the president pulls me aside and says he wants to apologize for how the board handled my case. He says they relied too much on one person's judgment and did not do their due diligence. I tell him apology accepted, but it should not have taken a police report and an arbitration threat to get here. He says I am right, and the board is committed to doing better. I tell him I hope so, and I walk out. The fence project wraps up the next week, and I file the final inspection with the city. The inspector comes out and signs off on everything. I email a copy of the inspection report to the HOA just to close the loop. The attorney replies and says thank you and congratulations. I do not reply. I sit down at my kitchen table and look at the stack of evidence I collected over the last 2 months. I think about uploading it to the neighborhood Facebook group, but I decide against it. Sarah told me to keep it professional and not gloat, and she is right. But 3 days later, someone else uploads a post about Brenda. It is a screenshot of the board meeting minutes from last month, and it shows a recorded vote where the board formally censured Brenda for acting outside her authority. The post includes a note from the board president saying that certain enforcement actions were found to be inconsistent with the covenant and have been reversed. The neighborhood group chat explodes. People start sharing their own stories about Brenda. One person says she threatened to fine him for parking in his own driveway. Another says she reported his kids for playing basketball after 5 in the evening. A third says she called the police on his dog for barking during the day. The stories keep coming, and by the end of the night, there are 47 comments. Someone starts a petition to recall Brenda from the board, and it gets 30 signatures in 2 hours. I do not sign it, but I watch it happen. The next board meeting is standing room only. People show up with printed copies of the covenant and questions about enforcement. The president tries to keep the meeting on track, but people keep interrupting with complaints about Brenda. Finally, someone stands up and reads a statute citation into the minutes that shuts the threat down. The statute says HOA board members can be removed for cause if they violate their fiduciary duty, and cause includes fraud, harassment, and selective enforcement. The president says the board is aware of the statute and has already taken action. Someone asks what action, and the president says Brenda is no longer on the board, and the landscaping committee has been dissolved pending a policy rewrite. The room erupts in applause. After the meeting, I get a text from Sarah. She says she is proud of me, and I should be proud of myself. I tell her I am just glad it is over, and she says, it is not over. It is just the beginning. She says the new policy will protect future residents from going through what I went through. I tell her I hope so, and she says she knows so. I thank her for everything, and she says anytime. A week later, I get a notification that someone posted about me in the neighborhood group. I open it, and it is a thank you post from a resident who says my case inspired him to fight back against an unfair fine. He says he used my arbitration playbook, and the board dropped the fine within 3 days. The post has 62 likes and 15 comments. People are calling me a hero and saying I changed the neighborhood. I do not feel like a hero. I just feel relieved. The final piece falls into place 2 months later. The HOA freezes enforcement pending a policy rewrite, and during that freeze my case gets cited in the board meeting minutes as the reason why. The president reads a statement saying the old enforcement process was broken, and the new process will be transparent, fair, and accountable. He also says that any resident who believes they were unfairly fined under the old process can request a review and possible refund. 3 people request reviews that night. Brenda does not show up to any more meetings. I hear through the grapevine that she moved to a different neighborhood. I do not know if that is true, and I do not care. What I do know is that her group post gets removed and replaced with a correction that says the board found errors in multiple enforcement actions and residents should contact the management company if they have concerns. The correction does not name Brenda, but it does not need to. Everyone knows. I finish my coffee and look out at the fence one more time. It is exactly where it should be, exactly the way I wanted it. I pull out my phone and take one last photo. Then I put the phone down and walk inside. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.